before. It was very special. And in 1864, the treaty was signed. So we're going to be coming up on the 150th anniversary this summer of the 1864 Geneva Convention, which was signed by 11 European nations. And it bound them to treat enemy combatants humanely once the battle was over, and to set up medical volunteer aid societies. And according to this treaty, called a convention, these battlefield volunteers were to identify themselves by wearing a white armband with a red cross on it, on their armband. And so for this reason, they became known as Red Cross societies, and the Swiss committee became known as the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now some have asked, well, was this a religious symbol? Were they religious? Well, Dunant himself was religious, but the Swiss did not choose this for religious reasons. It was the reverse of the Swiss flag. However, in 1868, when Ottoman Turkey joined the movement, and you'll see a Turkish flag right there, a reproduction of one that Clara Barton got much later, the Turkish representatives said, well, the cross isn't really going to work in Ottoman Turkey. We've had some experience with crusaders who have crosses on their shields, and we fought them off. So how about we use the crescent, the red crescent instead, which is on the Turkish flag? And so the Genevans, the committee, said okay. And this is really important because it meant that they were flexible when they encountered an unforeseen potential obstacle. They adapted their idea. And perhaps I would posit that this is another successful characteristic of successful humanitarian entrepreneurship. And thus the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement was born. And you had national Red Cross or Red Crescent societies being founded in different countries in Europe as well as Japan. And the International Committee in Geneva, which was composed of 5 Swiss citizens, and oversaw the enforcement of the Geneva Convention. So how did Clara Barton get involved in all this? I'm talking about Europeans and I'm talking about businessmen, not Americans and women. Well, Clara Barton, remember, had gone to Switzerland to recuperate. She was exhausted. And in fact, when Louis Appia visited her, she really indicated as much. She was just not interested. You know, she took the pamphlets, she politely talked to Appia. But after maybe, a year and a half or so, the Franco-Prussian War broke out between France and the German states in 1870. And Appia and his associates invited Barton to come along with them and observe the Swiss Red Cross in its work. By this time, Barton had recuperated somewhat, and Barton was not one who would turn down an opportunity for such an adventure. So like Henry Dunant, Barton was in the wrong place at the right time. And because she was invited by the Swiss Red Cross, she couldn't get onto the battlefield areas because she was an American woman, and no military men wanted ladies on the battlefield, much less some foreign ladies. So what did she do? Well, she innovated. Rather than sticking to the then limited mission of aid to battlefield wounded, which was the Red Cross mission, Barton got some funds from the Duchess of Baden, the Grand Duchess of Baden, to provide aid to the civilians of Strasbourg when it was under siege by the Duchess' husband, the Duke of Baden. And so under these strange circumstances, Barton pioneered the idea of the Red Cross as Red Cross humanitarianism as an activity that extended not just to wounded combatants, but also to civilians. And the Grand Duchess, who was also the daughter of Kaiser Wilhelm I, became a dear friend of Barton's. And Kaiser Wilhelm awarded Barton the Iron Cross of Prussia, and she was the only woman to receive this medal, and maintained a friendship with the Grand Duchess to her death. Now, Barton stayed in Europe for a couple of years after the war, and then returned to the United States. One of her sisters was ill and was dying. But she promised the founders of the Red Cross movement that she would start an American Red Cross. But not only was Barton sometimes ill, and when she came back to the U.S., she had to rest some more, she became ill again. But even when she became better, the the action, the task of transplanting this European movement to the young United States proved a really hard sell. Americans had little interest in creating this volunteer aid society to prepare for the next war. And why is that? We'll try this on for size. The United States did not consider itself a military power and did not think that it would be likely to engage in major warfare in the near future, except for minor skirmishes with native peoples in its western territories. The United States at the time had a tiny standing army that was decreasing in size from about 37,000 in 1870 to 27,000 in 1890. And obviously during this time, this was the beginning of the waves of immigration, the population was growing. And so now our population is 5 times the size it was in 1890, and our military has grown to 52 times the size it was in 1890. So proportionally, in relation to our population, the military has grown by a factor of 10 by this time, in this period, over 1,000%. So we can see that putting ourselves back there in the 1880s, that the U.S. was not a place where there were very few people proportionally in the military, even compared to now. So in addition to not having much of an army, Americans in the late 1870s had no appetite for thinking about war. The Civil War had killed 750,000 people, as many as 750,000, and displaced many more. You hear about Americans now being war-weary, and I won't get into that, it's controversial, but how do you think Americans felt after the Civil War, and then 12 years of Reconstruction in the South? Americans were finished with anything military. And so in 1877, the year at the end of Reconstruction, Barton tried to take the idea of the Red Cross and the U.S. signing on to this Geneva Convention to President Rutherford B. Hayes' cabinet secretaries, and what happened? She was rebuffed. Now, since the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. did not interfere in Europe's sphere of influence, but also by this time, Americans and the small State Department regarded European nations as somewhat decadent, somewhat politically backward, aristocracies or monarchies. So why would we want to sign a treaty with them? So what did Barton do in the face of this defeat? Well, she did what any good entrepreneur does when the first version of their pitch does not succeed. She revamped her idea to fit the particular needs of the growing United States at that time. The country was becoming unified through the thickening network of rail networks. Remember, we had the transatlantic railroad connection in 1869 and telegraph networks that go with it. And it was unifying this country into a connected whole. Our country was really turning inward to its own development. We were building major industrial cities and great transportation networks, and really, for the first time, expanding and utilizing the agricultural capacity of the Midwest and the West. And such changes are economically what made our country, by the end of the century, the leading industrial and economic power. But these changes caused quite a bit of havoc along the way. Urbanization and crowding produced diseases, epidemics like cholera that plagued cities in the 1850s and 60s. There was the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. And the expansion of farming in the West led settlers to encounter grasshopper plagues on the Great Plains. And lastly, and most spectacularly, with the expansion of the rail networks, there were awful train accidents that increased year by year as the volume of rail traffic and the system's capacity expanded. And so in the face of all these this upheaval and all these problems, Barton innovatively proposed that the American Red Cross would not focus on, in peacetime, on preparing for neutral battlefield assistance to wounded combatants, but instead would focus on aiding the population in what she called national calamities: floods, earthquakes, epidemics, fires, storms, etc. In its relief operations, the organization aspired to uphold the International Red Cross's ideals, the ideals implied in the Geneva Conventions. And Barton identified these ideals as humanity and neutrality. Now, humanity came from the notion that all people have a duty to aid others who are suffering, if they're able to do so, because we're all humans and we're all endowed with individual rights. So it comes from these Enlightenment ideas of individual rights and the rights of man. But neutrality came from the wartime context. And so how is this going to translate to peacetime? I mean, it's one thing to declare yourself a neutral party in a conflict, raising the white flag or putting on the white band with a red cross. But how do you remain neutral when the ostensible cause for your intervention is a disaster? Because in the U.S. of this era, well, there were fault lines. But where were the fault lines? Well, they weren't between warring nations. They were between different groups of people within the country. There were social borders of class and religion and gender and race and ethnicity. And they were being constantly challenged and renegotiated, and sometimes with hostility. And so Barton reimagined neutrality in this context to mean a form of social, egalitarian, humanitarian assistance. In 1903, she summed this up by saying that the American Red Cross, quote, must be free from all shadows of sex or race and must give to the Muslim, the Israelite, and the heathen the same consideration it accords to the Christian. And her vision encompassed not only combatants, but civilians, in peace as well as in war. And this is really Barton's unique and pioneering contribution to the International Red Cross movement. This widening of focus to civilians and this widening of neutrality beyond a commitment to treat members of different armies with the same humane care, but to treat all people well regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. So she really began to transform the Red Cross movement as she transplanted it to the United States. So one may ask, well, okay, these are great words, but what did this really look like in practice? What did she do? Well, I'll give you an example. In 1889, a flood drowned Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And this flood was not an ordinary flood. It came from the fact that there was a dam around a man-made lake in the hills above Johnstown. And this dam was not well maintained. It was quite neglected by the owners. And the owners belonged to a group of industrialists who used this lake for fishing and hunting. And so when the rain came, the dam burst, and it sent millions of gallons of water hurtling into the valley below with little warning, and upending and inundating a whole town. And it killed over 2,200 people in nearly an instant. Now, there were a number of organizations then who came to aid the Johnstowners, the most prominent being the Flood Relief Commission, which was led by businessmen in Pennsylvania, including one member of the very club whose negligence had caused the catastrophe. And the Red Cross came in on its own. Barton, within a few days, had assembled a corps of 50 volunteers, including surgeons, nurses, visitors, suppliers. And as the Flood Relief Commission's report indicates, a number of organizations contributed to the flood relief, and in fact these included fraternal organizations, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, the Masonic orders. And they actually contributed financially more than this infant American Red Cross, which contributed about $39,000. But the Red Cross nevertheless filled an important niche in the relief effort by providing individualized, immediate emergency aid before permanent relief funds could be distributed. In addition to clothing, the Red Cross provided people with household items, donated mattresses, bedding, sheets, furniture, even utensils for eating. These are the kinds of things you don't think about losing in a flood. To distribute these donations, Barton organized the women of Johnstown into what she called a ladies' relief committee. and really empowered them and made them agents of their own recovery. And she later estimated that the committee had served more than 20,000 people and supplied 3,000 homes with what, quote, the essential foundations of a complete household. And this committee really formed the caring counterpart to the cold, systematic relief administered kind of slowly by the Flood Relief Commission. The Red Cross also expressed a very personalized compassion in its medical work, attending not only to the physical ailments people were suffering as a result of the flood, but to people's psychological shock of losing their families and houses. In their canvass, Red Cross workers found numerous cases of what they called nervous prostration and, quote, temporary insanity. The Red Cross workers treated these cases in their medical tents, and this attention may well be the first recorded instance of mental health care in the wake of a disaster. And so Clara Barton and the American Red Cross distinguished themselves by offering a personalized touch, by providing people with the little household items they needed and the emotional comfort to get them through this tragedy. So that by the time Barton and her band of a dozen or so assistants left, the local paper wrote, quote, "She has indeed been an elder sister to us, nursing, soothing, tending, caring for the stricken ones through a season of distress such as no other people ever knew." And this was what humanity looked like in action for Clara Barton's Red Cross. It represented personal sympathy, traditionally often associated with women and women's groups. Now, 4 years later, the American Red Cross again provided assistance when a hurricane struck the coastal islands of South Carolina. And this was a very difficult operation. Like the Johnstown flood, the Sea Islands hurricane had struck unexpectedly, and it had drowned houses full of people in minutes. It had also left about 30,000 people without homes, basic necessities, and the means for making a living. And it had left bodies unburied and epidemic disease threatening. Now, at first, the people living in the Sea Islands, who were fishermen and farmers mainly, received no aid from outside. But within 10 days or so, the governor of South Carolina decided something needed to be done. And so he called upon Barton and her Red Cross. And when Barton arrived in the Sea Islands and surveyed the situation, she concluded that it presented, quote, a harder field than Johnstown. More people to care for, more destitute and helpless, spread over hundreds of square miles of territory, cut up by streams from ocean-sized to rivulets, subject to tides and full of malaria and fever. And she wasn't sure how she'd be able to help. Also, because the people affected were African American, and this was South Carolina in the 1890s, the disaster did not receive much attention in the press. And this discrepancy in coverage, the Johnstown flood, for example, had gotten front page news spreads for many weeks. This was really important because newspaper coverage really was the largest vehicle for publicity that the Young American Red Cross and other aid organizations had at the time. This is how they raised their funds. People would send funds to the newspapers, and then the newspapers would give them to the aid organizations. So Barton agreed very reluctantly to take on this project in the Sea Islands. Now, with characteristic persistence, she got the newspapers and a few prominent people in New York and Philadelphia to help her raise money for the people in the Sea Islands. Now, the newspaper articles really show who was donating. It wasn't necessarily wealthy philanthropists. For example, you have a Mrs. E.G. Klingelman of 261 Hooper Street in Brooklyn, provided a package of clothing. An anonymous donor, identified only as a, quote, poor friend, gave 25 cents. Philadelphia raised some money, but even people in South Carolina, for example, quote, and I quote this, 3 colored churches, quote, of Society Hill, South Carolina, who raised $10 to send to the sufferers. And this is still the type of giving that the Red Cross does, right? Raising funds from ordinary people. This is what one scholar called a philanthropy of plain people. And this is the model that Barton pioneered, to get a lot of people to each donate a little to support this organization. I used to call this checkbook compassion, but now I call it text message compassion. And it's certainly been a vital expression and continues to be what I would call a vital expression of American democracy. We saw this after 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, and last year's Boston Marathon bombing. But back then, it was a little harder. You didn't have cell phones, you didn't have the quick methods of getting money to people, and not much money was raised in the Sea Islands for the people in the Sea Islands. The country was actually in a depression in the 1890s, and the sympathy of these Northerners for the Southern Sea Islanders was somewhat limited. They raised about $30,000, so it was something, but they didn't, that still was funds were still kind of short. So how did they operate? How did Barton and her Red Cross operate in this time of yawning need and inadequate resources? Well, once again, they innovated.